Very good.
Yeah, exactly. Top it off. And if you don't know, they're just drinking. Right.
Good evening. I'd like to call to order the September 24th, 2024 work session. At this time, I'd like to announce that the meetings of the Mechanicsburg Area School District Board of Directors are being recorded and live streamed for the purpose of transparency and increased public access. The live stream, along with recordings from previously held meetings, can be found on the school board's YouTube channel. We move on to item 3, budget and finance. Item 3.01, grants update, federal and state. Mr. Longwell.
Thank you. So I think I'll start with just at the 50,000 foot view. We monitor the budget throughout the year. We have a budget process that really probably stretches throughout the year. We'll talk about that a little later this evening. Dr. Bitts and I are very involved in that on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis. But one aspect of that is our grants. I would categorize our grants as those being recurring, a lot of federal grants, the title grants. I would also say that we've, in recent years, received some one-time monies, PCCD as an example of that. And so, as our board knows, with any one-time money, you have to be careful about what it is you're purchasing with those grants, because that money might go away at some point or another. And then thirdly, I would say we have kind of a category of some other grants that we want to talk about a little bit with the board. Not huge sums of money, but just an awareness that we have received some monies for things like Ukrainian refugees. We have a little bit of money left over for ESSER, but I would say just a very little bit of money left over for ESSER. And so this evening we'll talk a little bit about the grants update between Dr. Bitts and I, and share with the board kind of where we are in terms of some spending this year there. So again, those kind of 3 buckets, if you will, the recurring federal grants. There's Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, and IDEA Part B. These are important revenue streams for us, but I would say in particular, because of these federal grants, they come with a lot of compliance requirements. And I think Mrs. Huff did that for many years with the district and probably remembers that little 1 or 2% of funding causes a lot of other reporting and compliance requirements for the district and all districts. The state grants, we'll talk specifically about PCCD and that this evening. And then also, like I said, COVID relief funding and some other grants that we'll just touch on very briefly. So to kind of talk about order of magnitude, the recurring federal grants, you can see there Title I, Title II and IV, Title III, and then IDEA Part B. We'll talk on the next slide a little bit more about what we're using those funds for, but I'll say we're calling them recurring grants because by and large we do and can expect to receive these funds on a pretty consistent yearly basis. They might change a little bit because of factors like enrollment, relative wealth of the district, free or reduced percentages, and socioeconomic. But generally, pretty steady stream of revenue for us, and we'll actually talk on the next slide here about some of those specifically. But order of magnitude, Title I, one of our biggest, as is IDA. And then we do get some additional funds through Title II, IV, and III. So, in terms of those areas, Title I largely is salary and benefits for some reading teachers, language arts, instructional assistants. Likewise, with Title II and Title IV, salary and benefits for instructional coaches. Title III, ELD teachers, instructional assistants, after-school math program, and then IDEA Part B. You'll see more around student services and special ed. It works a lot of that through Mr. Bingham's office and student services. That's special education teachers, social workers, instructional assistants, extended school year, contracted services. And so we tend to charge the same types of things to these grants on a year-over-year basis. And we have to do an annual budget with the Department of Education, and then follow, like I said, a variety of other compliance requirements. But just as a general idea of the types of things that we're charging against these grants federally.
Mr. Longwell, picking any one of these at random, like the instructional coaches, this Title II and IV don't fully fund them, right? Like
They're often percentages of them.
Okay.
Yeah, especially to your point, if you recall on the prior slide, Title II and IV, you can see at 159,000 or Title III at 850,000. Those are percentages of positions that we're funding or charging, I should say, to the grant is another way to say that. Whereas Title I and IDEA might have larger percentages of staff, perhaps. The state grants, now I mentioned that's probably a little more of a one-time money, although PCCD has been administering grants for several years now, at least. If you recall, kind of a little bit of a walk down memory lane, PCCD used to have behavioral health and physical safety split. And so you can see we have some funding available there. But we also have another allocation of monies from PCCD for behavioral health and physical safety where they combined them together. And so said another way, in some prior state budgets, they were keeping them as separate streams of revenue, and then they had their own requirements about where you could or couldn't spend the money. With the most recent iteration of that, they've combined it and kind of eliminated a little bit of the silo and giving you a little more flexibility to say which of those areas and what might you consider there. So again, kind of like the federal grants, just a general idea of where we spend the money and how we've budgeted things. In terms of the behavioral health PCCD grant, the first one, we've used a lot of contracted services, training and intervention, specifically around behavior through student services, but in working with our buildings. Physical security, because of the nature of physical security, I won't necessarily get into the details of where we've spent that money because we don't necessarily want to disclose where our strengths or weaknesses might be, but suffice it to say, we've been continuing to have conversations about how we maintain a good physical security of our buildings and using this money to supplement those efforts. And then as a final note there, the combined grant of behavioral health and physical safety, our intent is to use this grant to provide funding or at least some additional funding to support the ongoing safety resourcing initiatives or conversations that we've been having with the school board. And so I would expect that this is one part of it that will support the conversations that are to come. And so more details will be forthcoming in future meetings. So.
Is this the grant that's brand new, like this year, that they just?
This is the most recent one, yes. Yes.
There was one that we had applied for that we did not receive, but this is an updated one even since that one.
Yeah.
So do you think that will reoccur every year too?
That's it's in the budget on an annual basis, and so for a couple years now they've done it, but then you can see how they've changed the iteration of it. They combined them into one, and so where they're heading with that, it's a little hard to tell. I can say 3, 4, and 5 years ago, these didn't necessarily exist, and so there's really no guarantee around that. So we have been very purposeful in our conversations to say, if we put anything in these grants that might be recurring, are we prepared to step it into our budget so that we have sustainability? Or if we put things in these grants, are they more one-time purchases, I'll say, where we're not necessarily looking to purchase the same thing year over year over year. And so we have a lot of those conversations as well.
And in this case, there was a state mandate for safety resourcing too, right? So like we, even if we wanted to abide by the rules of not using one-time money or to fund staffing, we're sort of stuck doing that, even though there's uncertainty around the funding in the future.
Yeah.
Right. It's great.
So probably in case of especially the last one, that's tied to, I think, some future conversations. And so I think that maybe touches a little bit on what Mr. Sanker was alluding to. So COVID-19 relief funding and other grants, I'll say this, we got an influx of money, as the board recalls, through the pandemic. And initially, a lot of it was around how do we respond to the pandemic directly, and whether that be health and safety measures or any costs associated with that. Then we started to pivot and spend a lot of that money more in terms of how do we support students, what's the academic needs of our students and those things. We've really, and I'll say this, in a good way, managed those federal dollars, with and working closely with the school board and our administration and our staff. We did used the money over multiple years where we stepped it out of the budget, so we didn't have a funding cliff. I know there's some school districts that maybe were carrying a big amount of money in their budgets, and then the funding goes away, and now you've got a hole in your budget, right? You know, and so we've been purposeful about how we wanted to use the money in support of coming out of the pandemic and supporting our students, but also keeping an eye on the long term to say, over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, where do we want to be when that funding goes away, so that we haven't created a different set of issues. And so credit to the board, credit to the administration and staff. I think we've navigated that well. The funding was helpful, and we've also positioned ourselves well that we're kind of turning the chapter and closing out all of our ESSER funds, which also had a whole another set of compliance requirements on top of even the recurring title grants. And so that's been very good. And the credit to not only our administration, but our staff, because there's many people involved in managing these grants and making sure we stay, in compliance. So.
Greg, on the Ukrainian one, you said the original amount is 24,000, but then there's 20,000
remaining. So in some cases, we've spent some of the monies in prior years where the grant period might lap over the fiscal year. I think it's a good question, because with the title grants, often they're kind of assigned to a school year. With some of these other grants, they might go over 2 years or over 3 years potentially. I'll say that the ARP homeless, as an example, is one. That one's got to be spent this school year. I think the Ukrainian refugee one is a similar one where there's a little bit longer of a grant period, but we also have to be mindful of getting that spent down too. So.
I'll just add to that, some of these, and you can obviously see from the name of it that it's a very specific population, very specific need that it's targeting. So some of these, quite frankly, can be challenging to spend at times because there's so many stipulations to it. And this is one that, quite frankly, as we look to how can we continue to spend that down, we're struggling with it.
Do we have to give it back then? If you don't spend it?
If you don't spend it, it's the end of the grant period. I think potentially you face that. I think our goal would be to whatever, and this is Dr. Bentz's point, some of these grants, and that one in particular, has a very narrow focus of where you can spend the money. And so obviously students are always first, and we want to spend the money in support of the students where that eligibility exists. And but we also don't want to overstretch ourselves to the point where we're trying to fit expenditures into a grant that that might violate some of the compliance things there. And so if we do get to the end and we've supported the students and families and we feel like we've done our very best and have to return a little bit of the money, we never want to give money back, especially me. But if it comes down to that, then at least we have stepped through the process in a good way. And again, little detail like the other slides, ARP Homeless, obviously to support our homeless students through Student Services, Paul Bigham's work and his team, and then Ukrainian Refugee Grant, I think obviously is probably more specific to educational expenses for students identified as refugees. And that's where, depending on the grant, you start to narrow just what you can spend the money on. So that's a very quick overview of our grants. It's one aspect of managing all the finances of the district. Like I said, probably actually the next agenda item, we'll talk a little bit about the budget development calendar and the larger general fund budget, but we wanted to at least lead into that by sharing with the board an update on where we are with our grants.
Just have to take a second to add the amazing job that Mr. Longwell does to provide leadership over all of our grants, but I know that he would agree that really the folks that really dig into it is Mrs. Woodall, who's here tonight, and Mrs. Ely, who wasn't able to come tonight, but the two of them are an amazing tag team to be able to navigate all of the stipulations of all of these grants and make sure that we're complying with everything related to that. They're a great team at doing that, so thank you to you, Sherry, and certainly to Bob as well.
And thank you, Dr. Bentz. We'd be remiss if we didn't, I think, recognize those two especially of all the staff.
Can I ask a question in this? I think in this is the right topic for this. Where does the new student teacher funding come in?
Yeah, that's another one we've talked a lot about.
Yeah. So kind of related in some sense because it's money coming from the state. It's different in that we are really in many ways a pass-through for that money in terms of the student teachers. And actually, we just signed on today officially to be one of the districts that are participating in that. So we were waiting for a number of answers from FIA in particular, who was the organization that had this handed to them to be able to run with. And they've been really working on trying to pull it all together here in a short period of time. And we finally got enough of our answers or questions answered that we felt comfortable with signing on. But long story short, basically anyone who qualifies through the state to receive that as a student teacher would be getting $10,000 during their student teaching semester. We are not in charge of identifying who those students would be or anything like that. We get notified by FIA to say that this student qualifies, they'll be receiving this check. We receive that money and we just give it right out to them. In addition to that, cooperating teachers of those student teachers will get a $2,500 check to serve as cooperating teachers. That money does not go through us. That money gets passed through the university that is sponsoring the student teacher. So if the student teacher is coming from Westchester would be sending the cooperating teacher $2,500.
That's helpful to know that it's a pass-through. That's not something that we look at, and that's also good to know. Thank you.
Any other questions? Item 3.02, Budget Development Calendar 2025, 2026. Mr. Longwell.
Thank you. So we talked maybe on a smaller scale about an aspect of our finances with grants, but now as we pull ourselves out of the weeds and think a little more about the general fund budget, I would say that in a lot of ways, this is a year-long budget process. I know here it's showing starting in September, but I can share even as we get through June, July, August, we're always monitoring the budget that's being implemented, but also the budget we're closing out and how did we end the year, we're preparing for the audit. Again, Ms. Zealy leads a lot of those efforts, but working with a team of folks as well. I think if I were to generally capture or summarize our budget process, I would say what I appreciate the most about it is I think it's a thoughtful and thorough budget process. I think we engage many stakeholders, from our teacher leaders to our non-instructional administrators, to our academic administrators, to cabinet, and we're really able to define the needs of our programs, our departments, our buildings, try to establish priorities, because we know that at some point we've got to develop a budget that we've got to make decisions, right? And so what priorities are there in that budget process? And ultimately, this framework kind of gives, I think, the board a sense of what's happening in each month as we move from the fall to the winter months and then into the spring. And so again, without probably touching on every single thing individually, I would just call out a few main pieces there that our department coordinators and our teacher leaders, they're often presenting their budgets in the fall, and then that turns to the winter months where our non-instructional administrators and our building principals are presenting their budgets, and then cabinet ultimately presents their budgets as well. We kind of pull all that together and say, what are the needs of all of these cost centers? What staffing requests have come through? We look at all the trends in the budget to say, where are we heading with earned income tax? Where are we heading with real estate tax? And we really pull all that together into a kind of a draft budget for the school board. And so all of that work culminates then in a March board presentation where we break it into two-part presentation. We come to the board with a revenue presentation for the general fund and also an expense presentation of the general fund. And then Dr. Bitts also engages the board with conversations specific to all of the staffing requests and what we feel that we can put into the budget and other things that we may have to defer. Very valid requests, but possibly have to defer for future conversations. And so the other thing I wanted to call out as part of that then is as we do move through the fall, the Act 1 resolution, we often adopt the Act 1 index. Because of certain of our funding requirements for the upcoming year, we have to adopt the Act 1 index anyway. And I know our board for a number of years, we've adopted the Act 1 index, that we would live within that. But this year, there's just a little bit of a subtle difference that we would need to adopt that Act 1 index as part of the whole process.
at the risk of perhaps everyone is comfortable, but just to make sure, since this will be the first time through the budget process for a few of our board members, do you mind talking a little bit about Act 1 for everybody? Just
Yeah,
along well,
certainly.
and what is the purpose of that, and what do we mean by Act 1?
No, I'm glad you asked that. And that's a good point, good question. So Act 1 is, there's two components to the limit that we can raise taxes, and that's really that Act 1 index, right? So the first component of it is the base index that's applicable to all school districts in the state. And so that's based on a variety of factors, including state wages, statewide wages. And so that calculation PDE publishes in the fall, and here's the base index that's applicable to the whole state. Then for school districts with a market value aid ratio of greater than 0.4, so without getting too technical, really it looks at the relative wealth of a school district. If you're above 0.4, then they allow you to go above that base index by an additional multiplier. And so when you add those two components together, it gets you to, here's the Act 1 index, the kind of the total limit, if you will, that you may increase taxes up to as part of your budget process. And when I say this, is why I'm glad Dr. Bitts asked the question, when I say about adopting the Act 1 index, you might think, what's the alternative to that? The alternative is that you would apply for referendum exceptions, and you would present a preliminary budget, which is even earlier than the budget we present in March. And so it kind of changes the timeline and trajectory of your budget process. But really, the referendum exceptions, what that allows you to do is, within an additional set of calculations, you can go above whatever that limit was to raise taxes, right? And so sometimes you might see schools that might be up in the 6, 7, or 8% range, and you wonder, well, how's that possible if the Act 1 index is maybe at 4 or 5%? And it's likely because they used referendum exceptions to get there. There used to be 10 a long time ago when I started in Newport, but now we're down to, I think, 3 exceptions that can be used: special ed pension and grandfather debt, which even that one's kind of, I think, going by the wayside a little bit. So the only other way to kind of adjust taxes above the index is if you take it to a referendum, to take it to a vote. And there's not been many successful instances of that across the state. I'd hate to hazard guess, but I think it's very few.
For many years, there was only one.
Yeah, it was one for a
many,
long
many
time.
years.
And we still might be at 1 or 2. And in that one instance, I think it was, they had to build like a walkway across, anyway, it was.
It was a unique circumstance that,
Yeah.
yes.
So,
I think it's important for particularly our 3 new board members that if you have any questions on this now or as the process goes through, as you came in midway last year, speak up or ask questions, email them if you have them. It's a very important vote we take every June, and probably the most thing that the public watches the most, is the budget and the oftentimes associated tax increase.
I think the other part of it I would just share just generally, and you can see it a little bit in the budget development calendar, but as we go in the coming months, the Act 1 index is probably one of the first major steps to say we're going to live within this tax increase, right? And that kind of sets the bookends for the upcoming budget conversations. But beyond that, there's a variety of other decisions that ultimately feed into the budget too. And so, for instance, we have a CBA that we've agreed to, and that goes over a number of years, and so that gets programmed into the budget. And those were some decisions that we've made over the years. There's the CTC budget, and there's the CAIU budget, and there's our decisions about what we do with staffing, right? And so as we go through the fall and winter, I think you'll see some of the different conversations we have with the board ultimately are elements of variables or factors that ultimately feed into the final budget that you'll see in March. And we'll try to make some connections with the board as we go along the way to talk about how the budget process in itself sometimes I think could be looked at in a vacuum to say it's a singular process, but it's a singular process that really starts to wrap in a lot of other decision-making processes that tie it all together. So.
I think this is an important point because, oftentimes I reflect on the being on the board, and it is such an important position because it's really one of the only elected positions that every year you vote on how much you're going to tax your constituents, and that's a direct tax to your constituents. So it's an incredibly, I know we look at these the board but the budget process and whatnot, but it is really like one of the only elected positions that you're voting every year directly on your constituents.
It's
And
my two retired neighbors over the fence, as I
Yeah.
walk out through my yard.
yeah, no doubt, and it's a huge responsibility, I mean, huge.
And I think, maybe within that, you can see all the people who are involved in this processes, right? So it almost is many committees or subcommittees that are of stakeholders are feeding into the budget process and vetting it out and saying, what are our priorities and how do we get to a final point, and then ultimately, where we present with the board and talk about where we're landing. The final piece I will say is from the March presentations, then we have a two-part adoption. As the board may recall, or some of the board directors maybe were for the first time through this last year, we will adopt the first reading of the budget in April, following those March presentations, and then we will adopt the final budget in June, where we set the tax increase. And so some critical points along the way, the Act 1 index, what we're doing administratively to prepare, the presentations that ultimately follow in March, the conversations around staffing, and then ultimately that culminates with the two-part budget adoption in the month of April.
But I think it needs to be said, we don't have to raise the taxes at all. We don't have to use that number that we get from the state every year either. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in all my years, we've had a zero one time,
Right.
1 year.
Last year, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, what was the regular index and adjusted index, and we didn't even go up to the regular index
Yeah, it was-
last year. We were able to stay short
It
of
was
that.
high, it was like 6.1, I think.
Inflation year.
Then we were in the threes, and so I think, there's Act 1 in some ways, there's multiple ways you can approach the budget process, right? So you can kind of look at it as singular, like what's next year hold, which I think that's really important because it's the year closest to us, so we have to be aware of that. But I think also to see where we're heading in years 2, 3, 4, 5, because I think Act 1, rightfully so, instituted some collars and some limits that help manage like what's happening from a tax perspective and a taxpayer. But then I think also being purposeful to know that, if you go too many years and you fall behind the 8 ball pretty quickly, you can deplete your fund balance and some other bad things can happen. And so those are a lot of conversations we try to strike the balance of what's happening next year, but then how do you kind of also take into effect what's happening potentially in years 2, 3, 4. I think you get too far out there, in fairness, there's a lot of uncertainty in years 4 and 5. And so the decision making and what impacts that, I think is certainly balancing the short-term needs versus the long-term needs. And the final thing I'll say about that, maybe to Ms. Morgan's point about zero, interestingly, I've seen in some other school districts. I was an auditor before I came into the school world, and this happened at the prior district that I was at. If you look over the totality of, say, 10, 15, 20 years, you can see a bunch of zeros, but then you see some really big increases. And so when you average it all out, interestingly, a lot of schools end up on that same pace. And so it's almost like, do you keep a slow, smooth, steady handle on the wheel, or do you, a bunch of zeros followed by, in one case I was aware of 11 and 25 back-to-back years. And so they had to use exceptions and grandfather debt, but 25 and 11, I think it was.
The question is, was that zero in a time where you have hold harmless in a growing school district? Probably not. Okay, but
We do now.
yeah, like.
Josh, I'm sorry, I don't want to, I got your point that it's an important thing that we do, but like everybody, all the local officials have that ability to raise taxes too.
No question, but we directly vote on the tax. We directly vote on a tax increase.
Right, I agree, but that's no different than the Board of Commissioners in Upper Island. And
No,
right.
local, I'm talking local.
Yeah,
Local
but
governance.
I think also it's like the idea that, our state legislators vote every year on what to tax us directly, and the fact that they don't change that, or haven't for 20 years, is one of the multiple contributing factors to why our funding is so out of whack with this from the state and the local level. And so I feel like we end up
Holding back.
well, yeah, exactly. And
I'm
it seems like we're having this conversation like, what can we raise taxes to this year? And it's like, I also agree that zero sounds really nice for me too, but it's like, unfortunately, we are, I think, left holding the bag when it comes to all sorts of things. I know you know that.
Yeah.
Just like, that was sort of the other half of that coin of, what you were saying, that,
Well,
Yeah.
I think, no, this is actually a great conversation because I get what you're saying, but we have a responsibility to our community. And I think that's felt most at the school board level. To your point,
yeah.
that people at the state level and federal, I mean, they're not gonna raise taxes and we're left holding the bag. So I think that's a huge response. I mean, there's a reason why, during COVID, everybody was concentrating on school boards.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, this is a huge responsibility to your community. And unfortunately, I would argue that I'd love to see a school district that had a 0 in hold harmless while your school is growing by the rapid rate we're growing. I think that would be.
All I'm saying is,
yeah.
There were years we had 0, then we had 1 or 1 and 1.5. I mean, it was very low compared to nowadays. But
Prior
yeah,
to
we
the
had
pension.
agreed to include growth for the last 6 years
For construction, yeah.
for construction. So I understand that, but I'm saying years before that,
The largest driver was the pension increase.
yeah, we had to pay for the pension
When that
increase
started,
for
to
10
make up for the
years.
deficit, it's.
And I think those are all really good points. I think just to circle back to, because I did want to answer the question accurately, the index for last year adjusted was 6.5%, and we went to 3.9%. And so I think something Ms. Morgan said is also a really good point, is that at that 3.9%, that included a percentage set aside for construction and a percentage set aside for operations. And that's the slide I always visually go back to in my mind, that over the last number of years, we've set aside 1% or 1.5% of the increase to help fund construction and kind of step that in, so that as we go with our construction projects, we're building up our debt service, we're paying for all the construction, and then operationally, we've been adding another 2% on top of that 1.5%. So it's kind of a composite. That's where we've landed with our final recommendations.
Mr. Longo, are we adopting the resolution early this year for the Act 1?
So we would.
Don't we usually do that in January?
So a lot of years, we'll do it in November or December, to your point, Mr. Rupp. The time of year depends. You can do it in January, even if your board meeting's early enough.
Right.
Presidential election year throws off the calendar too. And the fact that we already know we're going to adopt, I think because of the funding requirements for the resolution, we thought, we'll just go ahead and move forward with the resolution, file the paperwork with the department, and then later this fall, we intend to do some additional budget work with the board where we come back and talk about, as the audit's wrapped up, Dr. Bitts and I've talked and intend to come back to the board with kind of a look back at 23, 24. We're working 3 years, so I'm just trying to keep them all straight now. So 23, 24, 24, 25, and we're working on 25, 26. But this fall, we'll come back and talk about 23, 24, and talk about some key trends that we saw in 23, 24 that will ultimately impact the 24, 25, 26 budget process. Things like healthcare and what's happening with pension, and where are we with these, where's the IT at? So that'll be a conversation this fall, and we'll look forward to that as well.
So the difference is just administratively being requested this year to suit our needs, but there was no change, I guess, at that point. In the
I
law
forgot to
itself.
mention that the rate probably has gone up too for cyber schools that we have
That's another
we have to
trend.
pay for too, so. Until there's some resolution at the state level for that, we're holding the bag for all that.
Okay. Any other questions for the administration on the budget development calendar? Moving to item 4, curriculum. Item 4.01, comprehensive plan update, goal number 2. Dr. Bitts.
So last work session, we had a chance to be able to share with the board some plans related to goal number 1. We talked a lot about curriculum assessment and instruction, and dove in a little bit deeper to our early literacy work that has been happening over the last year. I will give you a preview that will be coming back at our next work session to give you the next installation of the early literacy planning. But today we turn our attention to goal number 2, which was supporting student needs through instruction. And if you remember, our focus initially here, where we've really been spending the greatest kind of effort, is in the area of behavior as it relates to our needs for students. Tonight, it's going to be, as opposed to looking fully into the future, tonight is going to be a little bit more, quite frankly, celebratory of some of the work that has been done in this area already in the comprehensive plan, and particularly last year and over the summer in preparation for this year. So Mrs. Woodall and Mr. Bigham are going to be presenting together, and I think even that in and of itself should be something that as a board you're proud of in noticing that we have two sometimes seemingly separate parts of the house that are working together in new ways, and this opportunity through looking at behavior has been one of those ways that they've grown closer together. So Mrs. Woodall really focused on the Tier 1 curriculum and academic program for all students, and Mr. Bigham typically representing more the Tier 2 and Tier 3, the specialized needs for our different students. Those two are joining forces and working together, and will be presenting together what steps we have taken here with our positive behavior intervention support. So I'll turn it over to them to take it from there.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bitts. And again, thank you for giving us the opportunity to provide you with a overview of the things that we have been working on for the past few years. You know, one of the components of our goal 2 is the positive behavior intervention support. There are some other things that support student needs through instruction that are also concurrently going on, not at the same level, but we're going to be talking specifically about what it is that we're looking at it from a positive behavior intervention support piece. And if you recall, looking at comprehensive plan goal 2, you know, we have 3 overarching goals looking at behavior support and the purpose of a behavior support committee. And that's to look at the environments that support and promote positive behavior. So what is done from a district level to a building level to a classroom level, and how the integration of those level-based supports come together in order to be cohesive, both from a systems, looking through a systems lens, but also looking at the individual needs of students through the process. So Dr. Bitts talked about what's done at Tier 1 or the curriculum level, which Mrs. Woodall looks at, and what's done, you know, for all students, and that is what is the curriculum base. And then what is done for some students, where what we do for all isn't just enough. So we need to look at, you know, how we navigate and provide those supports within the system across K through 12, and how that works from a district level of support to a building level support down at the classroom level. So one of the things that we talked about looking at the overarching goals in refining the district's response to behaviors of concern is what happens when behaviors occur. You know, what do we do in response? You know, how are we supporting and looking at the true nature of what discipline means? Discipline means to teach. So if all we're doing is punishing or providing consequences, then are we really teaching? And then that third overarching goal is looking at how we're supporting it across for all kids to some kids to make sure that what it is that we're doing is meeting the needs of each of our learners. So if we go the whole way back to 22-23, we're looking at you know, the formation of the Behavior Support Committee from the district's perspective. And this was a group of 20 individuals of various talents and abilities and certifications, from administrators to psychologists to classroom teachers to specialists, and looking at everybody bringing their perspective K through 12. So we had representation across buildings, representation across grade level bands, and representation across experiences and certifications, all coming together to look at the common core classification of what is behavior. And we started looking at the ABCs of behavior. And before we can look at anything, we had to develop common vocabulary. A lot of research-based instructional practices, looking at books. Mrs. Huff, I know that you'll be impressed that you know, we took the opportunity to learn from one another. We broke down into groups. We had to define what behaviors were, what we would do to change behaviors or shift behaviors before they occur, when they occur, and then what happens once behaviors occur. So the antecedent is what we can do before a behavior occurs. The consequence is what comes after the behavior. So we started to look at what is the behavior itself and how do we define that. And our goal was to define those characteristics and develop some guiding principles that we would then use as, in the military, we call it left and right limits. We call it boundaries in bowling, where the bumpers are. Where do we operate within the lane to make sure that what we're doing is through a systems approach as opposed to a reactionary approach. And making sure that what we do at the primary level leads to the intermediate level, leads to the middle level, to the high school level at an age-appropriate manner. Okay? So we did a lot of research. We actually came up with those guiding principles, and in April 11th of 2023, we did a K through 12 professional learning by elementary level and secondary level. We met as a K through 12 system, broke down and did elementary and secondary, and developed a common vocabulary, developed some scenarios, really putting the staff on the same page, developing that baseline of understanding. And through that baseline, we're able to start to have conversations about then what can we do to differentiate by level. So if we look at those behavior guiding principles, again, these are those baseline approaches. These are 10 statements that basically talk about what we believe as a district K through 12 about behavior. And through the foundation of these guiding principles and that dissemination of that professional learning, we established that common baseline for our staff and for our building programs as they look at their positive behavior intervention support plans at the building level and develop those cultures within their district or within their buildings in order to be able to support the needs of our students.
So then looking to last year, in 22-23, we created the philosophy, the guiding principles of what are our parameters with behavior. In 23-24, we were looking at how are we going to support our building teams with more in-depth information. So part of that started with a district-wide committee needs behavioral needs assessment, where we went through, we had a framework from the Center on PBIS, which is Positive Behavior Intervention and Support. We utilized their tier fidelity inventory, and we modified it to meet what we value here at Mechanicsburg. So we weren't necessarily looking at quantitative numbers, but we were looking at qualitative descriptors for us to have discussions as the committee. From there, the committee identified 3 areas of support for last year that were needed to identify. The first was the development of common behavioral expectations K-12. So as a committee last year, we created the common behavioral definitions or expectations that I will get to on the next page. But that was committee work where we looked at our vision, mission, and beliefs, and we pulled out expectations and behaviors from those documents. And our committee actually first identified 10 behaviors that we all agreed on, and then the committee rank ordered, like each individual person was like, I think this should be 1, 2, 3, 4, and Mr. Bigham created a lovely spreadsheet that correlated all the numbers to come up with what our top 4 expectations are, and we created that vertical articulation K-12. Then we also, as the committee, recommended a PBIS building team meeting protocol. That protocol is a problem-solving tool, so as building teams are having their meetings, they're utilizing similar language. So if I'm at the high school, my protocol is the same protocol as kindergarten academy. We're using the same protocol, so we have the same language, so the meetings are set up very similarly, which is great. As you matriculate through the system, we're able to have that information to evaluate our tier 1. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I wanted your last point on ranking the behaviors and 10 behaviors. What's an example, or what is the number 1 behavior that came out of that?
So I'll move on here.
I'll help you with the understanding.
So looking at the words that came up based off of what our committee pulled out from the mission, vision, and shared beliefs is respectful, responsible, resilient, and safe. So those are the 4 terms that we said, these are what we need to teach to our students, K to 12, to have that common language.
All right, thank you, sorry.
No worries.
Just to speak to that, the comparison would be, you might remember, prior to this, we had the Wildcat Way, which was K through 5, then 6 through 8 had a different listing of expectations, and they were teased pretty mightily because it was called the Cat's Code, but they had a picture of Carson the dog on it. So people were all there, Cat's Code, but you got a dog. And then the high school didn't have anything prior to that of any kind of expectations. And when we talk about positive behavior support, one of the big pieces is, what are your expectations that you're trying to teach students and then ultimately hold them up to? So really in the same vein as the idea of transfer goals, K through 12 being what are some of your goals for students K through 12, the committee developed these 4, which then each level was able to take to be able to apply to their own.
And I noted that the Wildcat Way changed this year at back to school night to match those 4 that you just mentioned. So thank you. I'm getting it. Thanks. Keep going.
And then the 4th recommendation from the committee was looking at what data are we utilizing to evaluate our Tier 1 system. So we're using this office disciplinary referrals and attendance and nursing visits. So we made recommendations as a committee as to like, what is the best data for us to use and what else do we need? What information are we not gathering from the data that we have? So those were all recommendations that the committee created last year that are still moving forward into this year. So the big win from last year was the common expectations K to 12. So as Dr. Bitts was saying, these are like the transfer goals. So just like our transfer goals curricularly, we have K to 12, the same transfer goal. We now have the same behavioral expectations K to 12 transfer goal. But as you were saying, Mr. Sanker, it does look differently depending on the level. So we're still using respectful, responsible, resilient, and safe. You can see the middle school with Cat's Code, which now has a cat on it and not Carson. The middle school said these words, we love these words to teach to our middle school students. At the K-5 level, they wanted to look at it at more elementary, but it still holds that same value. Communicate with respect is respectful, act responsibly. Take on challenges is resiliency and staying safe. And at the high school, they wanted to go a little bit higher level. So again, they used the word responsible, but overcoming challenges. So relating that to the resiliency. Attitude and approach, respect. So how are you approaching people with respect? How is your attitude showing respect to everybody? And then reinforcing safety. So the Wildcats ROAR is their acronym. But again, they all tie together to those 4 words that are our transfer goals. This is a look at our PBIS in action this year. So you can see these are all in different buildings, but they have similar formats, similar language. I love the Kindergarten Academy one because again, it breaks it down into being developmentally appropriate. We care for others and our school is respect. We use kind words. We care for others in our school is responsible. We use kind words as respect. We keep our hands and feet and objects to ourselves, safety, and we try our best as resiliency. So again, just looking at how those words are developmentally appropriate, but aligned to our transfer goals. And then these are some images of the pictures that we have at the middle school and high school. So you can see Cat's Code where they're defining what does it look like to be respectful, responsible, resilient, and safe in the cafeteria? What does it look like to be respectful, resilient, responsible, and safe in the hallway? So looking at how those matriculate up through the system. So we're really proud of the work that we did last year with that, and over the summer, the buildings are doing an amazing job with teaching those expectations to the students this year, designing lessons. So great work was done, and we still have work to move this forward, again, looking at the data, the protocols, and then delving into Tier 2 and Tier 3, the advanced tiers this year as well.
I'm just impressed you got 6 dogs to look the same direction.
That's him.
I can't do it.
They're trained, you know, they have a high degree of training, so therefore, they do anything for kibble.
Oh.
I was gonna say, does Andre really have that high level of training?
What does the tier one look like? At elementary, I know that they used to do the meetings where they bring the kids all together. What happens at the middle school?
They're-
I don't know.
They're still, at the elementary, they're still doing the meetings like that. So at the middle level, they have an enrichment period built in where they're teaching those lessons, and the same thing is happening at the high school as well.
Advisory.
Advisory.
Yes.
Okay.
They're calling it
And they're
crew
using
now
all
at the high
this, all the work that you did to bring that language in.
So that brings us to, you know, this school year and looking ahead to the things that we have planned for this year, which will be coming back to the board at a future board meeting. But it's about building connections and looking at how the last 2 years, what we've gained in establishing those baseline connections and establishing those common language and transfer goals that are now permeating the K through 12 system in a level appropriate manner, and how we're infusing those pieces, looking at behavior, but how behavior intersects with what we are doing academically, what we're doing to support our students and the needs of our students and through their wellness, and how we are looking at our committee approach this year. I will tell the board that we're looking at taking our positive behavior support committee, providing a little bit more of an expansion to the membership for that committee for the purpose of splitting the committee, because we need to continue to work on the things that we are doing for all students. But then we also need to start to learn, grow, and explore and start to navigate what are we going to do for the support for those where what we're doing at the tier 1 level for all students is not enough. And then what is the passage through those levels of support? You know, you can't provide a high degree of support for a large number of students because you don't have the staff, the resources in order to make that occur. So you have to establish what are the gateways, the signals that we're going to use, if we're looking at John Tanner's terms, to make sure that what we're doing has the evidence to support the fact that it's making a difference in the support and the needs of student needs, and also giving our programs the support and our staff the support that they need in order to continue to do their work, to do all of the other pieces that are involved in the education of our students here in Mechanicsburg Area School District. So more to come from Mrs. Woodall and myself coming back to a later date and time. I don't know if that's a warning or if that is a you know, a lob out there in the future, but we will be back.
I have a comment. Can you go back to the beginning of the presentation?
Sure.
I hate to bring you all the way back because I'll tell you when it's, keep going. Is that the beginning?
This is the very beginning.
Go to the next slide. Next. Right here. So I struggle as we try to support positive behavior in our schools, okay? I struggle, and I think the board does because we've had conversations about this. Everybody's at a different level, about C, consequence. You know, I think punishment, as I grew up, when I was growing up and when I was in school, it played a big part in molding my behavior. And I don't know where that fits in the schools anymore, because I do believe consequences and punishment, I think, Mr. Sanka, you had made a comment about this, that it has a lot to do with your parenting at home as well. Like if I was ever to get a detention at school, that would have been horrible. It never did, by the way. Shocking. But if I did, that would have been a horrific event in my family, and I would probably have took the long way home for many days or hours. But I just struggle with this. I think we have to find a balance with this. I think there is a place for punishment, and I don't know. And we're talking about positive behaviors, and I really appreciate your comment when you said that consequences are or is more about learning, or I forgot what you said about punishment.
Discipline needs to teach.
Correct.
Yeah.
Discipline needs to teach, which is great. There's different ways to teach. Where that lies, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I'm old school with that, and I think I want to see our schools still teach core values, but have a robust.
And there are 4 different ways that you can look at behavior. You know, there's positive reinforcement, there's negative reinforcement, there's positive, behaviors, and there's negative. I mean, there are certain things that that you can look at, with regard to how you approach the specific incident. There are non-negotiables. I mean, we have non-negotiables. There are things that if they occur, there is a natural consequence, and it is usually a punishment. You have and then there are things that you can do differently, restoratively. If you look at how I can curb or change a behavior, and what I do for a first grade student may be different than what I do for a senior, with regard to the level of consequence, depending upon the action. So if you look at positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, you have a different theory that you could use and a different approach, based upon the behavior of concern. So it's looking at it holistically as opposed to a thou shalt not type concept. And I think that that's something that we're looking at, and we're still having ongoing conversation as an administrative team, as a district, as a committee. We're still learning and growing and trying to figure out all of those different intricacies that could occur, because there are people who have a similar belief. When I went through school, I won't say when, but if I got in trouble, which I did, and I did get detention, and I learned from that. And I did get twice the consequence at home that I got at school. So, those are things that are individual parent decisions, so we can't dictate that as a system. And there are some times where we're being asked to provide universal disciplinary means, and everybody has a different interpretation of what that could look like. So we have to develop what's in the best interest for all of our students in that process as well.
And I think that also goes into effective, like when we talked about the protocol and problem solving, and when we problem solve for some students, there are some students that might discipline and the rough consequences may be beneficial. There are some students that you can see if they keep getting office disciplinary referrals over and over and over again, and they keep getting detention over and over and over again, then we need to look at a different problem solving method, because the consequences they're receiving is not impacting their behavior. So now we have to look at, we have to do that problem solving.
It's reinforcing.
Yeah, no, right.
Because they're seeking the attention. And they don't care if it's negative, if it's positive.
Or if it's a student who doesn't miss a school and you give them a detention and they add or suspension, what does that do?
Mm-hmm. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I agree that positive reinforcement is better. I mean, it's obviously better to head that off before it becomes behavior. Is that part of the protocol, is training the teachers to identify certain behaviors and what that could mean for the student, so they can have early intervention leading to tier 2 and tier 3? Is that kind of the process? Like,
Right. And part of the guiding principles is, we don't evaluate, we don't judge our students based upon their behavior. Behavior is a manifestation of an unmet need. It's usually to escape or to avoid something or to get attention, right? So there's a purpose behind why students do what they do.
They may not be consciously aware of it, but there is a purpose.
Right. And sometimes we need to look at what's the root cause of that behavior as opposed to the behavior itself.
Right.
And we start to evaluate kids and label kids based upon what they do, then we're really losing the connection as to who they are. And I think that's part of the learning piece, and part of what we need to take into consideration as we move forward is, there's a reason why they're doing what they're doing. And if we don't start to listen to that or try to identify with that, then we are just feeding into the perpetual downward spiral of that child and their opportunity to graduate, their opportunity to meet with success, lessons and lessons with each day that we ignore or don't identify with the signals they're providing in order to get them the assistance and help that they need.
I mean, a good example of this is when I think I was in 3rd grade, I was misbehaving. And luckily my teacher identified that I was just bored. class. So he gave me something else to do and it solved the problem. Even to this day, when I'm bored, I get in trouble. So, but at least I have the tools maybe to understand, I gotta keep busy, you know? So it seems like something like to that degree, instead of just punishing the kid, which might just make them, you know, rebel more or dislike school more, let's give them the appropriate help and supports.
I'm not advocating that we put paddles in all the rooms here, okay? I mean, I don't want everybody to think that I just said, but everybody, I'm not advocating for that.
I think it's representative of absolutely a debate that not only is happening right here, but is happening within our schools, among our administrators, the conversation of what, the goal is change behavior. We gotta keep our eyes on the prize. The goal is change behavior to positive behavior. That doesn't mean that all the ways that we change that behavior are all positive reinforcement. There are negative reinforcement. There is punishment that's involved in changing those behaviors. But the goal is changing the behavior to be positive behavior in our schools. And there's a lot of different perspectives on how to do that, and students have changed. I think each of us that have served any time as administrators, as building administrators, have had that moment where we've continued to beat our head against the wall saying, well, no, this worked for me and this worked for our kids and I gotta keep doing it this way, I gotta keep doing it this way. And you realize, you know what, I can keep doing it that way, but kids have changed, their needs have changed, and to some degree, we've gotta accept that and meet them where they are. So it's an ongoing debate, and certainly this committee has done a lot to help our district continue to grow in it. So thank you both for your leadership.
I have another question before I didn't scrap that, sorry, but how can we measure the success of this? They seem to put time into it, adding to the committee. Certainly, it's a goal of ours, a comprehensive goal. So what are some of our measurements of success on a short-term, long-term?
So that speaks a little bit to the one piece that Mrs. Woodall talked about of different data that we collect. Frankly, part of this year's work needs to be to kind of align our system of data collection a little bit better so that we know when we're coding things, for example, as being a fight or coding something as being disruptive behavior, that there's a little bit more consistency to those codes so that we're able to track that data over time and see, okay, in this building, we're continuing to see this particular issue cropping up. How can we better address that particular issue? Last year for high school, they were having a lot of issues with tardies. It's obviously an easy one to track. If you're late for tardy, that's a pretty easy one. But they were seeing a lot of those issues, so their positive behavior support team focused in on what are some interventions that we can do to be able to remedy this tardying issue. And they've been able to do that. We've seen the data go down for that. So we already do a lot of that data collection, but it does go beyond that to looking at things like attendance, to looking at things like nursing visits and some of those other pieces that we can get into.
Is there some way that once the behavior happens, the consequences being drawn out, is there some data collection after the fact to understand better what was missed or why that particular behavior happened and what we can do to improve the process? Is there any of that may be?
So that's where we start looking at the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 level. So at the tier 1 level, as Dr. Bitch was saying, making sure that we have consistency in our definitions of what it is that we're reporting for office disciplinary referrals. But once we have that consistency, you can start to see, like I'll say, for example, when I was a building principal, we would see office disciplinary referrals would jump up daily between 10:30 and 11:30. So our problem-solving team, the building team, would get together and we'd be like, what's going on between 10:30 and 11:30? Well, in my building, that was lunchtime. And so we would have to do some problem-solving there around tier 1 of, we need to address this for all students. What are our expectations and behaviors when they're in the cafeteria? And we hit that hard instructionally. So we built lessons around that. So we made sure our students were aware of this is what's going on. Very similarly to what the high school is doing with parties and how they're instructing students, like this is what needs to happen for you to be here, these are the supports that you have. But you will still have outliers that, you know, will continue to be tardy or continue to disrupt in the cafeteria, and that's when you start looking at more of the tier 2 and tier 3 interventions.
How much is reflected with the individual teachers, different levels of tolerance or, you know, what they find that, you know, one teacher may be able to take some behavior longer or whatever than the next teacher, and so how do you?
So that is part of that
Balance.
consistency of trying to create that consistency within a building and a building level team, and how they're discussing that with their teaching staff. So like if a building principal is saying, this is what we consider a level 1 offense, if this is happening, you need to report it. And there are reports that go into office disciplinary referrals that are just like FYI for your information, that it's not necessarily the building principal needs to address that, but it is data collection to say this is starting to occur, where you can see we're getting a lot of patterns in these level 1 offenses that I'm not seeing as a building principal, but we're starting to see that rise. We need to address this with whole group lessons.
Just to add on to that, that's one of the reasons why through this process, we now have positive behavior support teams in each of our buildings. Elementary has long had positive behavior support teams, but middle school and high school had not. So those are building level teams that are charged with making the guiding principles come to life in their building and continuing those conversations in faculty meetings and in PD days, and they've been doing that. So that allows those scenarios to come up and say, well, how would you handle this situation? How would you? And the more you talk about it, hopefully the greater consistency.
I believe the word in the public sector, the phrase is iterator reliability. You know, so how do you make sure that what's happening in one classroom is being utilized in the same way or interpreted the same way in another? It doesn't have to be verbatim. You know, we're not trying to make carbon copies of our teachers and have them lose their individuality and the cultures of their own classrooms. But there needs to be some level of consistency in how teachers are interacting with students, regardless of who they have at a grade level in a particular building, across buildings, especially in our primary buildings where we have 4 different buildings. So, you know, it's looking at it from a systems-based approach in order to make sure that we are addressing things as consistently as we can, looking at those signals, adjusting, being flexible, and because, you know, you can have the best plan in place to support students, and then, you know, the needs of the students could change. So you have to have that ability to adjust when you need to. But there has to be some level of consistency in how we're collecting our data, as Dr. Pitts said, so that we can look for those patterns.
I appreciate all the work that you put into it. I know I think it's one of the most challenging aspects of education, and without it though, learning's not going to occur. So kudos for all the work you put into it and still plan to put into it. Yet to come.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Final questions? Thank both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Move on to item 5, facilities. Item 5.01, replacement track, high school. Mr. Longman.
Thank you, Mr. Up. With us this evening is Kelsey Lead from Crabtree Rohrbaugh and Brian Haynes, also from Crabtree Rohrbaugh. I know familiar faces to us as they've supported us through so many of our construction projects and have been a great resource for us in making these building projects come to life and really meeting the needs of, as we talked about earlier, what's happening with our academic program, what building and infrastructure needs do we have, mechanical infrastructure needs we have, but then also how do we address enrollment. As we've kind of turned the page on some of those conversations, you know, we understand that facilities planning or kind of the facility cycle, if you will, is an ongoing process. And so even though we've been on a journey for these last 7, 8, 9 years and talking about what the needs of our buildings are, we also recognize that the useful lives even of mechanical equipment might only be 15, 20 years. You know, roofs might last 20, 25 years. And so by their nature, there's kind of that ongoing process. And so as we've come through our construction projects, we decided to form, Dr. Bitts, myself, Dr. Lady, we recommended to form a facilities planning committee where we engage stakeholders to say, as we look out to 2030, what other buildings and grounds needs will have to be addressed to best support our learning community in the next 5 to 7 years. And so I think that led us to a variety of priorities, some individual projects even for consideration, but I would just categorize them as there's kind of the ongoing maintenance, if you will. That ongoing maintenance is what Mr. Hoffman brings to the board every January as part of the capital reserve fund budget. And so those really are in some ways our summer projects, in a sense, because he'll share those with the board, and then our goal is to really work on those over the summer. And so we recognize on a year-to-year basis, we have to give space for those conversations to continue to happen where Mr. Hoffman engages our building principals, our non-instructional administrators, our teacher leaders speak into those as well if there's infrastructure and needs there, but ultimately the ongoing maintenance. Then the other categories were around short-term needs and then also long-term needs. And so really, as you look out those next 5 to 7 years, in the short term, what are some priorities? And then in the long term, we know there's some other things we need to continue to investigate and will investigate with additional conversations with the board. Really, that leads us to tonight, where one of the short-term priorities was ultimately the high school project wrap-up, and maybe more specifically, the track and field replacement. And so as we move to the next few slides, I'll let our colleagues here from Crabtree Rohrbaugh talk through this a little bit, and then Dr. Bitts and I will jump in as needed, and we'll kind of tag team the rest of it. So.
Thanks, Rick. So I think you've seen a slide similar to this before, Brian presented, I think, at the last board meeting. So just to recap, there's been a couple meetings since the last time we presented, just arranging, just as a reminder, the initial project 2 scope of work did include restoration of that existing field area within that contract. So that was always going to occur to return that what's a lay down area right now for the contractors back to a practice field. In development of these additional upgrades, the biggest change is moving all the field events for track to the north part there as an overlay to that practice field, give it a dual purpose for the track off season as a practice field. In addition to that, the access road you can see in gray there rendered will be added. That in part is to accommodate one new consolidated storage facility for this complex, the sports complex here. Existing, I think there's 2 or 3 smaller sheds kind of west, if you're looking at that site plan of the Wildcat Center at the north end of the track. So those will be removed as part of this. Everything consolidated into one nice building with simple building with an access road. Included also is some fencing just to give that practice field a perimeter, allowing access still, but give it a perimeter at the Long Meadow Road there, access from Long Meadow, and then down at the softball field, replacing that fencing as well that's currently sitting at the top of the retaining wall that exists there, just to tie the whole piece of the site together and really complete that complex. The second piece of that is the track improvements, which include upgrades, complete replacement, removal and replacement of the existing track surface, as well as adding the paving perimeter to the inward side of the fence. Currently it's outside of the fence, the walking path around the track, and giving a new fence perimeter around the track area itself, replacing the gates and things like that.
The first item, restoration of the laydown area, that's like on the contractor,
Yeah,
right?
correct. Okay. That was in the original bid. Yep, okay. That was already part of this. So there's limited additional work in that upper area. Really, it's the addition, just the fencing, so that that field again has an edge because of the throwing events that are going to occur out there for the track. But
Just-
there's limited work with the field events to accommodate them.
Just to come back to that, that's one of the reasons, well, the main reason really why we're looking at this as a change order, because it is in addition to work that is already part of the project.
Good.
It's just a zoomed in, more developed plan than you saw last time. We're moving forward, developing the pricing documents for ECI to ultimately put a number together on. This plan is just highlighting the zones of the two structures that are proposed. The larger one on the top of the plan there is the storage building with the access road. And then to the lower end of the plan there, you see a score station, which is essentially in the same place the existing score shed is. It's just providing a new secure area for that to happen, very simplistic to match the storage building. Anything else?
On the upper edge of the field, is that the sort of jumping, long jump area, is that?
Yeah, so the infield of the track?
Yes.
Yeah, so all the jump pits will stay within, they're gonna get reconfigured and upgraded, as well as the pole vaulting area.
You'll notice too, this is, so right now, these pits exist as pole vault and long jump, triple jump, but looking to add additional triple jump or long jump pits here, so there could be some additional jumps happening at the same time. And that's partially due to shot put currently exists here behind that end zone, and shot put's moving down with the other field events out onto the
And on the right side of the field, that semicircle,
high jump.
is that
High jump.
high jump? Okay.
And that's already in that, that
That's
was
already
in
in
that
that
existing
space.
location.
Right.
So I've raised this question before, but recognizing how many years the track team has been displaced from home meets, is there any way that project could be expedited to be finished for track season?
So out of acknowledgement to that and knowing that this year's senior class will have not had a single home meet, we did ask that question, even though we knew the answer probably was gonna be no, but again, we felt like that really was something that we had to at least explore, whether it was an option, and it really isn't. The issue really is that the laydown area isn't even going to be ready to be able to receive any kind of seed or anything like that until next spring. So we'll still be in the same position as we are right now of not being able to have any, even if we found a way to somehow do the track itself,
Right.
we'd still be in the position of no field events.
I thought that was probably the case, but wanted to explore that.
Certainly worth asking.
And again, we certainly felt the same, that we owed it to those athletes to ask that question and explore it, and through lots of discussions with lots of different people, it just isn't viable, unfortunately.
So no resurfacing right now in the field in the middle of the track, just.
Correct. I think it's worth pointing out too, Kelsey, if you want to hop to that next slide, the scorer's station, which is there on the right-hand side, which will be, again, very similar functionality as what the current small green falling apart shed is. Ultimately, it's a score station, but it is going to be equipped with the ability to have sound, be able to make announcements for events like, again, most modern high school track facilities have. And we've, back when we did have our last home meets, it was always just a portable speaker that we were able to use. So this will be something that will be able to upgrade to what a high school track and field facility should be able to have.
So to Mr. Kickline's question, we're not redoing, what are we doing inside the track?
Still grass.
Still grass.
Current grass.
Why?
So our priority remains getting a turf field at Northside. Synthetic turf field at Northside.
I think,
As of
why?
Because it's a competitive space that will have greater functionality than putting a turf field here. Because even with a turf field here, there wouldn't be turf field events, competitive events that we would be able to have at that space because of the other facilities needed for that space. So we'd essentially be losing, as opposed to by gaining that at Northside, we're actually going to gain the ability to have additional events there, because that would be soccer, potentially lacrosse. There's a number of other sports that would be able to play on that field if the Northside site was synthetic.
Okay. But I thought, I had in my mind that it was going to be here because, or the intention was to be here because of the increased utility overall, not for competition as much as just using it more, including the band.
Yeah, I know that seeped out somewhere, and I'm not saying
It was in a
just
meeting we were
just to
both
you.
in, I think you said it, I don't know.
I don't think I said it, but there was a suggestion out there that we're somehow, that being able to turf the inside there was going to give some greater capability for the band. I'm not even sure that the band necessarily wants to leave the parking lot. So they're, right now, there is no.
They don't know how to leave the parking lot, that's the problem, they need to, they need to understand that there's greener pastures, artificial greener pastures.
Is there some safety concern with the band being in the parking lot?
I think there's conversations that can be had with the band about, and even as you look at the laydown space, and Kelsey, could you go back maybe to, we are going back to gaining an additional field space in that laydown area outside of track season. So suddenly we have a full-size field here, what may or may not end up being a full-size field here, but certainly it's going to be fairly large space. So we do have additional spaces. I think the band and the parking lot conversation is really a separate one from where is best. If we're going to do a second synthetic turf field, the best location, and Seth is absolutely convinced of it, he's convinced me of it, is definitely at Northside.
But at one point, we did have that on consideration. But then I think when we looked at the finances and when we had to limit what we were spending in the next waves, we took out the field, the synthetic field on the track. Because I remember that conversation of, we're not going to do the synthetic field and that we were going to do Northside instead.
And it feels like the finance part's a wash, right? If we're still doing turf, it isn't a finance consideration. Right?
If we were to do three.
If we were to do 3
Oh, I
fields.
see, in addition to,
So
okay.
we didn't have
yeah,
the money to be able to do
Yeah.
2 new fields.
Mhm.
And so it was which one was gonna be the bigger utilization, and Northside became the bigger utilization, so we're looking at, that would be the more logical one. If we had the money, we would have done, we may have considered both, but we were going Northside.
I'm settled on the idea of the most utilization. Thanks.
I think the other important point is that the work we're doing here doesn't preclude us from ever coming back and as a board administration saying, maybe this is a need in the future and we should do something with the turf here. I think it's a little bit of order operation. There's like all of the facilities planning recommendations and what are our nearest priorities and house funding, to Mr. Bradley's point, which I think is a good one, fit into that. And so we don't want to engage all of these projects at once. We kind of want to step through and manage cash flow and say, what are our greatest priorities, and kind of step through it in that way. And then the work we're doing here wouldn't have to be undone if we ever decided to come back for another conversation in the future.
This does get into the turf field, which is kind of a subsidiary of this, but I've heard that the soccer teams don't like the turf field at the park because it's narrower than their normal playing field. Is that taken into consideration when the new turf field will be built over at Northside? Is that a consideration to make it wider than that?
I'm sure it will be, because the
it's
field
narrow,
there
it's
now-
regulation, but it's like 10 yards narrower than
At Memorial.
I think in Memorial,
Yes.
it's like 10 yards narrower than Northside.
But the current
Current
field
north
at
side.
Northfield is a quote regulation soccer, so it
Yes.
has. Yes. I'm asking a question.
It is.
Yeah.
So that would be artificially turfed, the parameter is the correct soccer size.
And it sounds like the guy who's got the 1,000 30-foot view, who Seth is saying that we should be concentrating on north side.
No doubt.
So I mean, if he was wishy-washy about it and came to us and said, but if he's saying that, then he's saying that. So really, the only conversation with this is, does Mechanicsburg have an extra $2 million sitting around? $3 million, and if we don't, then it's a moot point.
Is there ample spectator seating in this design? I know before there's just like little aluminum bleachers set. I mean, I haven't been to a track meet. I don't know how popular they are, but I do know that I've been there for some other activities, and it's a lot of standing. So I don't know if there was a.
I think what you experience with track is that you're constantly on the move to different locations. So I think there continues to be a lot of standing, but any track meet you go to, even ones with stands, there's typically a lot of standing.
And this actually pulls it in closer as compared to when they used to actually do a lot of events where the academic building is now. So the parents actually have to walk over there for certain growing events. But you are literally all over the place as a spectator.
Gives access down to that lower field, I assume.
Yes, there's also a path, I believe, from here that cuts down, if I remember the.
You can get to there from there, the grade starts to really level out. It's actually a stormwater basin north of that storage shed, but it's a shallow, so you can kind of walk on the spur of that from that access road. And
We
there's
would
gates.
anticipate also continuing to have a couple small stands for seating here like we have.
So I haven't seen this illustration before, and I'm just questioning what those three triangle things are on that next one. Is it for throwing or?
Shot put, discus, and javelin.
You hope that they keep them in that.
I didn't
There's
know
some
if there were
staggering.
spotlights, like,
That's why we do this.
And that's why you have the fence, so you don't have people running onto the field.
so,
So this sounds like good news for the freshmen and not such good news for the seniors.
Some of them made it to states last year with all the way meets, so.
I mean,
so is the softball field being moved then? Or is that
It's still the same.
same
Softball.
place? I'll turn back here.
Yeah, by way of orientation, the Wildcat Activity Center's up here. That's the new addition to the high school, and it kind of wraps around. And that's the student parking lot. So Williams Grove's out here somewhere, right? And so the student parking lot, softball field, and you work your way inward to the track, and then on the other side of it, which
So
I think
what
is
about the tennis courts?
they're
on the
Yeah, I know where they are, but we're not doing any repair to them at all.
We had a pretty significant makeover to those not too long ago.
Less than that.
Those are
Like right before
pretty
COVID.
surface, maybe.
Dr. Betts, I find when we do these presentations, I ask like a ton of questions, like how are we utilizing this? How are we using? Could we get, I mean, I know that can we get Seth here and basically look at, I mean, we've done a lot of improvement on our facilities here where we have these, the all-purpose rooms that we put in that you can have academics and extracurriculars. We're putting a new pool in, we're doing these things. The Wildcat Activity Center. I'd love to have a presentation in terms of how we're utilizing this as a school district, how these are being utilized. Give us that overview. Like, listen, this is the new, while we put the activity center in, and these are the activities that we have in there, and you know, at the elementary schools, how we're utilizing. I'd love to see that. I'd love to know, like, how those are being utilized.
So it's a great point, and I think there's two different chances that I'll preview coming up. Talked about having Seth come in to do almost a little bit of a wrap-up of something that you were intimately involved with, which was the athletic program evaluation.
Yeah.
Because actually, as we upgrade these facilities and as we finished off the extracurricular committee last year and the fundraising discussion, there's actually pretty much all of those recommendations that were made by that committee are either finished or significant progress. So we were talking about having him and certainly do that. The other one is that we'll also be coming forward here in the next couple months talking about facility usage.
Yeah.
And talking about the fees and all those kinds of things related to, once all these spaces are online, what are our beliefs, what are our protocols for outside organizations utilizing these facilities? So I think between those two presentations, I think we'll get.
Yeah, that'd be great. 'Cause
get
we've
to
made
where
a
we're
huge
going.
investment, and I'd love to know how
Yeah.
they're being utilized.
Maybe if you could just show, I'm really joking now, just show us the schedule and challenge scheduling all these places, because I know how challenging that is.
Well, sure.
Yeah, it is, it's because they're full.
Well, it used to be unbelievable challenge
Yeah.
before we
Still-
added
yeah,
these facilities. It was
classes
just
are so
literally,
full. Mhm.
especially if somebody made playoffs and then you start to interlap with the next season of sports and,
Part of why we need all these
or
things.
activities, not necessarily sports.
So they're all very well used.
Yep.
The elementary gymnasiums, the block activity center, the gyms at the middle school, high school. Yeah, very good investments, especially for a growing community, growing school district.
And
The
as we saw
opportunities.
tonight, the cafeteria at the high school can be
Yeah,
used
there you
too.
go.
Yeah. Flexibility in their
You don't need to put it-
That's what she said.
We wanted to see the chairs in there, and here they were using it.
Yeah, that would be challenging.
Who
Any
oversees- who
additional
oversees that?
questions?
Who oversees that? The scheduling of all these?
I would say mostly Seth and Bobby Strickler as the key point people because of athletics, but then I think you very quickly look to recreation and
Yeah.
talk about Tiffany and
Yeah.
and those folks. And then Pam Lane, who is our facilities administrative assistant. She is kind of the keeper of the lease list. So outside organizations and everybody, clubs and everybody else, PTOs. So it's really those three are the heavy organizers.
Any additional comments on the replacement track?
Maybe the last thing then, I'll just share quickly, if all right, is our goal has been to continue working, developing kind of these couple priority projects that we were working on. And I'll say the other one, as the board probably recalls, is the middle school stair tower. And we're still working on that with both Kelsey and Brian. Our goal ultimately is to continue on a trajectory where come back to the October work session to present a final change order estimate for the replacement track and field for the board to review, but also provide a project update on the middle school stair tower and what our intentions are there and how that design work has come along. I think we've had a lot of great conversations there with the team. And then ultimately, that'll take us to November, where we would ask the board to consider approving the change order for the replacement track and field, but then also authorization to bid to get the middle school stair tower out, because as that progresses, our goal is for both of these things to begin kind of in the spring and into the summer, and hopefully have both of them well on their way to be done by the summer. So.
I don't have any final questions. Right, seeing done before we adjourn, just a reminder, is due to a community event next month. Our board meeting will be actually next Tuesday, as opposed to the second Tuesday. So we'll be back next Tuesday. So with that, the meeting is adjourned.